The first glyph lit while the roof was still coming down. Tavan Reth saw it through the dust, a thread of amber waking inside the carved stone face. They had spent 6 weeks refusing to touch, and then the spoil shelf above bore 9 let go entirely, and the world became noise. He was thrown against the survey bench. The bench broke. Somewhere to his left, a human voice was shouting names in the dark, one after another, like a man counting coins he could not afford to lose. Imka, Suli, Bren. The lights died. The amber thread did not. Tavan lay where the collapse had put him and watched, with grit in all 4 of his eyes, as a second glyph kindled beside the first, then a third. The carved face of the buried structure, the Relic's expedition had catalogued as Find 7, vanished builder architecture, access denied pending provenance review, was waking up in the only direction no committee had approved, toward them. Sound off. That was the young survey lead Dane Okafor. 24 years old, contracted labor, the man Tavan had twice reported for unauthorized proximity to the find. His voice came raw through the dust. Sound off now, Imka. A woman coughing, I'm up, I'm whole. Suli, a girl's voice high and furious. 15 years old and angrier at the mountain than afraid of it. I'm here. Bren's not answering. Bren's under the gantry. Piloves, said Tovan's own junior recordist, somewhere near the floor, in the thin formal register Kale students used when they were terrified and trying not to show it. Present, uninjured. Dr. Reth, Tavan got his legs under him, both sets. Present, he said, and his voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. Recordist, your lamp. Pilo's lamp came up, a cold white cone full of falling dust, and the bottom of bore 9 assembled itself out of the dark piece by piece. The crushed survey bench, the dead floodlights, the gantry folded over like wet paper, and behind everything, vast and patient, the carved face of Find 7 with 5 glyphs burning amber along its seam. The way they had come in was gone. 80 meters of access tunnel had become a wall of broken shelf rock, and the wall was still settling, stones grinding tighter with small, final sounds. 6 of them sealed in a pocket the size of a freight container at the bottom of a dead world's dry sea, beside a relic that had chosen this exact moment to open its eyes. Tavan Reth was a doctor of the Reliquary Survey, second chair of the KL mission to the world called VASC, author of the Standing Doctrine on Vanished Builder Access Protocol. None of it, he understood with sudden and perfect clarity, was going to matter down here. Help me lift, Dane said, already at the gantry, hands flat under the folded steel. Bren's breathing, help me lift. They lifted. All of them, the lead, the cartographer, the girl, the recordist, and the second chair of the KL mission, shoulder to shoulder in the dust with contract labor, because this alternative was listening to Bren Calder breathe in shallow wet pulls under a quarter-ton of gantry. The steel came up a hand's width. Suli dragged him clear by the harness, and Imka Reyes was on her knees beside him before the gantry crashed back down, her hands moving over his leg in the lamplight. Crushed below the knee, she said. Suit sealed it. He's not bleeding out, but he's not walking, and he's not Bren. Bren, look at me. Bren Calder, 26, rigger, the biggest man on the contract roster, opened his eyes and said, tell me somebody saved the coffee. He's concussed, Imka said. That was a joke, Bren said, and went gray and stopped joking. Dane straightened up. Tavan watched the young man do the thing leaders did or failed to do at the front of a disaster. He turned in a slow circle, counted his people, counted the exits, counted the hours. There were 5 people, no exits, and not many hours. Anyone could read that ledger. The pocket held air, for now. The dig suits were rated for atmosphere work, scrubbers in the collars, 12 hours each if nobody worked hard, and everybody was going to work hard. The comms relay on the wall had survived on backup cells. It was hissing static with a voice buried somewhere inside it. Water was a different arithmetic. Vask's dry sea had not always been dry, and the survey had logged a live aquifer under the site in week 1, capped, charted, supposedly asleep. From below the broken floor, soft and unmistakable, came the sound of it waking. Water, moving, rising into spaces the collapse had opened for it. Relay, Dane said. Imka was already at the wall, thumping the housing with the heel of her hand. The static cleared a fraction. 9, this is surface, bore 9, respond. This is surface, Fire speaking. Surface, bore 9, Imka said. 6 souls. 1 casualty, crushed leg, stable. The access tunnel's gone 80 meters minimum. We're in the find chamber. And she looked back over her shoulder at the amber seam burning quietly in the dark. Surface, the find is active. I say again, Find 7 is active. The pause on the line was longer than distance could explain. Bore 9, confirm last, said Osaviri, rescue lead of the lantern site, in the voice of someone who has just watched her week become her year. It's lit, Surface, Imka said. It's lit, and it's getting brighter. Tovan stepped past her and took the handset, because some part of him still believed this was a survey matter, and survey matters belong to the second chair. Rescue lead, this is Dr. Reth. Note for the record that the find's activation is unprovoked. No contact has occurred. Protocol 9 remains in force. No one touches the structure. From the floor, with his ruined leg in Imka's hands, Bren Calder laughed. It was not a kind laugh, but it was honest. "Doctor," he said, "the structure just ate the only door. I don't think it's waiting on your paperwork." The water below them found a new channel and climbed audibly through it. That was the first hour. In the second hour, Tovenreth did what he had been trained to do before relics of the vanished builders. The precursor race whose ruins seeded 40 surveyed worlds and whose locks had never once in 3 centuries of Kale scholarship opened for anyone. He presented credentials. It shamed him a little later how naturally it came. The collapse had buried their heavy gear, but his case had survived, and the case held the mission standing. The charter plate of the reliquary survey etched in 3 diplomatic scripts, the provenance seals of 9 institutions. His own authorship medallion, the one he had carried for 11 years, proof that the galaxy's living authorities deemed Tovenreth fit to stand before the work of dead ones. Doctrine held that the vanished respected order. Their ruins endured because they were sealed against the unworthy, and worth was a thing that could be documented. He had written that doctrine. He had defended it before the Reliquary Congress in Sarah Hall with 400 scholars in attendance. He laid the charter plate flat against the carved stone seam beneath the burning glyphs in the formal position of petition. The relic did nothing whatsoever. He presented the seals, 1 institution at a time, naming each aloud in high Kale as the protocol prescribed. The amber light did not so much as flicker. Behind him he could hear the humans working. Dane and Sully cannibalizing the gantry for stretcher poles, Imka splitting power between the relay and the lamps, and he could hear Pilo dutifully recording the petition, lens trembling in his young hands, documenting for the archive each item the relic declined to acknowledge. "Dr. Pilo whispered, "perhaps the authorship medallion." Toven presented the authorship medallion, 11 years of his life in alloy and enamel. The relic's glyphs burned amber and even, like a hearth bank, like something resting. Whatever Fine Seven was waiting for, it was not him. He stood with his medallion in his hand in the dust, in the dark, with the water climbing under the floor, and felt the first hairline crack run through the doctrine of his entire career. Hey, the girl, Sulitan, was beside him. She had a length of gantry pipe over one shoulder and dust caked in her hair, and she was looking at the glyphs, not at him. Up close, her face was younger than her voice. "What do they say?" "They are not language," Tavan said. "They are lock script, ornamental cipher. 300 years of scholarship has established that the vanished sealed their works against." "That one looks like a tally," Sully said. "Like marks for counting. We do that. 5 and strike through." She shifted the pipe and walked on. Because she had work, and a man whose leg was crushed mattered more to her than the largest archaeological event in living Kale memory. Toven looked at the glyph. 5 strokes. 1 bar struck through them. It did look like a tally. He put his medallion away. The case felt heavier than it had been. The 3rd hour belonged to the water and the air, and the relay told them how it would be. "Here's the picture," Osaviri said. Her voice came clearer now. Imka had rebuilt half the relay's guts from survey spares. The shell failure took the crane, the ramp, and the upper bore lining. "We cannot dig to you. The spoil's live. It moves when we touch it, and there's 80 meters of it." The aquifer cap sheared in the collapse. Site survey puts the flood rate at a pause. Papers. Someone else's voice low behind her. "Your pocket takes water in 9 to 11 hours. The flow's coming up under the whole gallery." "Air's tighter than that anyway," Dane said. He'd run the numbers on the chamber and the suits twice, out loud, where everyone could check him. Tavan had noted that, the way the young lead did arithmetic in public, so no one had to fear a private number. 6 suits, 1's damaged. Scrubbers degrade fast once the pocket fouls. Call it 14 hours if we're still. Less because we won't be. "Then listen," Vire said. "There's one more option on the table, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it walked back. Director Drum has filed for an emergency breach. A shaped mass driver charge set in the old core bore 90 meters south of you. It cracks the gallery roof, the spoil drains into the void space, and a recovery team comes down the new face." Silence in the pocket. "Rescue lid?" Tovan said slowly. "The core bore sits over the flood gallery. If the charge cracks the roof, the aquifer doesn't drain away from this chamber. It arrives all at once." "That assessment has been raised," Vire said, with the flat care of a person speaking near an open microphone and an open personnel file at the same time. "The director's modelers disagree. The charge is being placed. The window for the decision is 14 hours. I will fight it for every one of them." Vire out. The static came back like the sea in a shell. 14 hours, Imka said. "So that's our race. Drown at 11, suffocate at 14, or be rescued at 14 by a wall of water with a committee's signature on it." Heskel Drum, Bren said from his stretcher, "has never once been down a bore," he ordered Doug. "That's enough," Dane said, not sharply. He crouched by the relay, and Toven watched him look. Once, quickly, the way men look at a thing they're not ready to say out loud, at the only object in the chamber that was neither rock nor wreckage. The amber seam, the carved face, the 5 glyphs, and the tally. Dr. F, Dane said, you're fine. Is there a door in it? It is not a door, Tovan said. It is a sealed structure of the vanished builders. 40 meters of confirmed interior void rising through the rock above us, and in 300 years no vanished structure has ever. 40 meters up, Dane said, toward the surface. It is sealed. So was the tunnel, Dane said. Now it's the better wall. Doctor, I've got 5 people, 11 hours of dry floor, and a director upstairs who's going to flood us on a schedule. I'm not asking your protocol. I'm asking you, is there a door? And Tovan Reth, second chair, author of the doctrine, looked at the relic that had ignored his charter, his seals, and his life's work, and gave the only honest answer he had given all day. There is a seam, he said, and it is brighter than it was an hour ago. They went at the seam with everything portable in the wreckage, which is to say they went at it with hope and pry bars, and the seam ignored steel exactly as thoroughly as it had ignored credentials. The carved face was not stone under the dust. It was something older that had decided to look like stone, and it took the bar's point without a scratch, without a sound, without the smallest courtesy of resistance. You could not even insult it. It was Sully who noticed the water reach the back of the chamber, a black tongue sliding up through the broken floor plates. And it was Bren, gray-faced, flat on the stretcher they'd built him, who noticed what the water did to the glyphs. They're counting, he said. Tovan turned. The tally glyph had changed. 6 strokes now and the bar through them gone, and below it, faint as a watermark, a new line of amber had risen in the carved face, a long horizontal mark with a small notch climbing it, and beside that, unmistakable to anyone who had spent a life with survey instruments, a graduated scale, a depth gauge. The relic was measuring the flood. It knows the water's coming, Imka said softly. It counted us, and now it's watching the water. Lock script, Pilo whispered, recording. Ornamental cipher. He said it the way a child repeats a rule he has just watched break. The cold went through Tovan slowly, and it was not the cold of fear. 300 years of doctrine, said the vanished, sealed their works against the unworthy. 3 centuries of petitions, ambassadors, congresses, ordnance, and one famous siege had not opened so much as a hatch anywhere on 40 worlds. The reliquary's most secure conclusion, his conclusion, was that the locks answered standing, and no living species had standing. But this lock had not asked who they were. It had counted how many they were. It was watching the thing that threatened them, as if the question it cared about was not who stands before me, but something else entirely, some variable his whole science had never once thought to test, because his whole science had arrived at every door in the galaxy, holding up a seal and announcing its rank. Doctor, Dane's voice. What's it waiting for? I don't know, Tovan said. The words tasted strange. He could not remember the last time he had said them in the field. What happened next, Pilo's recording preserved in full, and the recording would one day be studied in Sarah Hall by 400 scholars in absolute silence. It began with an air alarm, Bren's suit, the damaged one, its scrubber fouled with rock dust, its collar light going from green to a slow, dirty orange. 11 hours of margin became a private 4 for the man least able to do anything about it. Bren did the math on his own collar and said nothing. They caught it anyway. In a chamber that small, a dirty orange light is a shout. And Tovan watched the humans hold a meeting about it that took in total 6 seconds and no words at all. Imka Reyes crossed to the stretcher, unclipped the buddy line from her own collar, the line that shared her scrubber, her margin, her hours, and plugged it into Bren's suit. Her green light dimmed one shade. His orange one cooled. She did not announce it. She did it the way a person passes bread at a table, and then she went back to the relay as though nothing had moved, while the girl, Sully, wordless, swapped her own full canteen onto Bren's stretcher and took his empty one. Halve her hours for a man who could not walk. Spend her water on a man who might not see the surface. In the doctrine of standing there was no column for this arithmetic at all. The relic sounded a tone. It was low and clean and architectural, less a bell than a building remembering it had a voice. And every person in the pocket stopped moving. The amber seam flared. Lines of light ran outward from it through the carved face, through the tally, through the depth gauge, through reliefs Tovan had catalogued as decorative, and now watched organize themselves into something with grammar. And the seam split, and the face of fine 7 opened along a join 3 centuries of scholarship said did not exist. There was no grinding. Stone that was not stone swung inward on the dark, and the dark inside was not empty. Amber light woke along the floor of a chamber beyond, low and warm, the way you would light a room for someone you did not wish to frighten. Dust drifted in the doorway. The water lapped the broken floor behind them. Nobody breathed. For the record, Bren said faintly from the stretcher, The door was opened by Imka Reyes, contract cartographer with one air hose, 300 years of ambassadors, and the password was, "Share your air." "That is not." Tavan began by reflex and stopped himself, because the only other explanation was coincidence, and he had stood before too many sealed doors to believe the universe spent coincidences like that. Dane picked up the head of Bren's stretcher. He looked into the lit chamber, then at his people, then last, deliberately, at Tovan, and there was no triumph in the young man's face, which was somehow worse. There was just the job. "Dr. Reth," he said. "Pilo, we're going through a door that opens for whatever we just did. Whatever that was, I expect we'll need to do it again. Stay close and bring the case if you want, but I'd pack light." They went in. The water came up the floor plates behind them, patient as an auditor, and the door of the patient house swung shut on bore 9 and sealed without a sound. The chamber beyond was long and narrow and rose at a gentle grade like a ramp built for short legs and burdened backs, and its walls were tallies. Floor to ceiling, thousands upon thousands of small counted marks, scored 5 and struck through, in bands and columns and clusters, some confident, some shaky, some so small and low on the wall that whoever made them could not have stood much above Tovan's second elbow joint. Sully walked with her glove an inch from the marks, reading them like weather. "Kids," she said, "these are kids' marks. Look how the 5s wobble." "The vanished builders," Pilo recited, hushed, "left no figural record, no remains, and no." He stopped recording the wall and started simply looking at it. At the top of the ramp stood the second door, shut, its own glyphs dark. Before it, the chamber widened into a round room with a dome ceiling, and in the center of the room, on a low stone table the height of a child's chest, sat a basin, empty, bone-dry, carved from the same patient, not stone as everything else, with a single spout at its lip, channels running from it across the floor, branching and rebranching to the walls like the veins of a leaf, and every channel dark. Above the basin set into the dome, a tally glowed amber. 6 strokes, no bar. "It counted us again," Imka said. 6 in, it knows we're 6. The depth gauge glyph was here too, beside the inner face of the door they'd entered by, its little notch of light creeping upward. Outside these walls, in the dark of bore 9, the water was rising. The Relic intended them to know it. The Relic was, Tovan realized, keeping them informed, the way a vessel's master keeps the passengers informed. "Doors dead," Dane reported, palm flat on the second seal. "No seam light. Whatever it wants this time, we haven't done it yet." He looked around the round room, basin, channels, tallies, 5 tired humans, and 2 rattled kale, and set the stretcher down gently. "So we work it. Imka, air check everyone, out loud. Sully, water inventory. Doctor, a beat, and then evenly. Like a man choosing to spend trust he could not strictly afford. You've read more dead rooms than anyone alive. Read this one." Tovan Reth stood in the lamp and amber light, with his ruined doctrine in one hand and his case of useless seals in the other, 6 hours from the water and a charge clock ticking somewhere overhead, and began, for the first time in his decorated life, to read a room of the vanished as though it had been built by people. People with children, people with thirst, people counting heads at a door, and not by God's grading applications. The basin waited, dry as the doctrine, in the middle of the floor. He read the room for 40 minutes, and the room taught him more than Sarah Hall had in 11 years. The channels in the floor were not drains. Drains run toward a low point. These ran outward from the basin and climbed, fine capillary grooves rising up the walls between the tally bands, terminating in small carved cups set at intervals into the stone, hundreds of cups. The lowest of them sat at the height of a standing child's mouth. "It's a fountain," Imka said, tracing a channel with her lamp. "Center-fed. Fill the basin, the whole room drinks. Then where's the feed?" Dane was on his knees, lamp under the table, no inlet, no pipe. "The spout's the only opening, and the spout points out, not in, the feed," Sully said from across the room, "is us." She was standing at the wall by the second door, where the tally bands gave way to a panel of relief carving Tovan had been working through with the slow dread of a man finding his own obituary in an old newspaper. The carving showed figures. The vanished builders had left no figural record on 40 worlds. That was the literature's bedrock. And here were figures in processional sequence, small and worn and unmistakable. A line of them climbing a ramp, carrying one of their own flat on a litter. The same scene, repeated in stages around the panel like instructions stitched on a hem. In the first stage, the figures stood before a basin holding vessels. In the second, they poured, each one in turn tipping a vessel into the basin. In the third stage, the channels were shown flowing, the cups brimming, and the figures drinking from the wall while the one on the litter drank first, propped up by 2 others. In the last stage, the door behind the basin stood open. "You pour in what you carry," Sully said. "All of you, then it gives it back, that's the deal." "That is a votive scene," Tovan said, but the protest had no bones in it anymore. He could hear the water gauge behind him. The notch had climbed 2 more graduations while he read the walls. 6 hours of dry floor had become something like 5. It's a kettle rule, Bren said from the stretcher. His voice was steadier. Imka's shared scrubber had pulled him back from the gray edge. Every site I ever rigged had one. You take the last cup, you fill the pot. It's not religion, doctor, it's plumbing with manners. Dane stood for a moment with his hands on his hips, looking at the dry basin, and Tovin watched the cost move through him. 5 people, 2.5 liters left among them, hours of heavy work ahead, and a carved wall asking them to pour their whole margin into a stone bowl on the strength of a picture. If the picture lied, the pour would kill them stupider than the water below would. Dr. Reth, Dane said, your read. Does this house lie? The question was so far outside any framework Tovan possessed that he answered it from somewhere underneath frameworks, a stratum he had not consulted since he was a student. It counted us when the roof fell, he said slowly. It measured the flood and posted the measurement where we could see it. It opened for an act of, he reached for a technical word and let it go, of care, and it lit the room before we entered so that we would not be afraid. Everything this structure has done since the collapse, it has done the way you would do it for passengers. No. I do not believe this house lies. Neither do I, Dane said. Canteens. They poured. It was harder to watch than Tovan expected. Water in a dig is hours, and they were tipping hours into stone. Sully first, then Imka, then Dane, then Bren's salvaged half-liter handed down the line. Pilo looked at Tovin, and Tovin unclipped his own field flask, kale issue, 11 years on his hip, and poured it out with the rest. The basin took perhaps 3 liters. Spread across its wide bottom, the offering looked like nothing. A film, a spit of rain on a dry road. For 10 heartbeats, that was all it was. Then the basin sounded the low architectural tone, closer and more intimate than before, a note they felt in their molars, and the film of water began to glow faintly where it touched the stone, and the level rose, not refilled. Answered. Water came up from the not stone the way meaning comes up out of a word, from nowhere a sensor could point to, cold and mineral bright, and it climbed the basin's sides and found the spout and ran, and the channels lit amber as the flow entered them, racing outward and upward through the floor and the walls until the whole round room was veined in running light. The carved cups filled, hundreds of them, brimming at the heights of children. The depth gauge by the door, the one tracking the black water below, kept its cold count. The house held both waters at once, the drowning kind and the giving kind, and wanted its passengers to know the difference. Bren first, Sully said, already carrying a cup. Bren drank first, propped on Imka's arm, exactly as the wall prescribed, and Tovan Reth stood in a room he would have sworn yesterday was a tomb and watched contract labor reenact a liturgy older than his species written, history because it was also simply the obvious decent order of operations. The thought arrived plainly without ceremony and rearranged 11 years behind it. The wall was not scripture, the wall was a manual, and the manual assumed decency the way his own field manuals assumed gravity. The second door opened while they were still drinking, no fanfare, no grinding. Just the scene parting and warm light beyond, and nobody noticed for a full half-minute, which Pilo's recording also preserved, and which a Sarah Hall annotator would one day mark with a single dry line. Note that the mechanism does not reward attention to itself. The relay found them as they were rigging Bren's stretcher for the climb. It should not have worked through 40 meters of builder stone, and Imka said so to the handset twice, but Vira's voice came through clean, cleaner than it had been in Bore 9, as though the house had decided the conversation mattered and stopped charging distance for it. Bore 9's surface. Tell me you're hearing this. We hear you, surface, Imka said. We're inside the find. We're alive, all 6, and we're climbing. The structures, she looked at the running amber veins, cooperating. A silence with several kinds of weight in it. Then, understood, 9. Status topside. The drill rig reached 11 meters and the spoil swallowed it. We lost the bore, no injuries. That was our last conventional option. And the director, Vira's voice flattened into procedure. Director Drum has confirmed the breach charge. Placement crew is in the old core bore now. Detonation authorization is set for hour 14 on the argument that your air ends at 14. Our air ended at 14 when we were 6 people in a pocket, Dane said into the handset evenly. We're in 40 meters of open structure now. Air's not the clock anymore. Tell him the math changed. I've told him the math changed. Vire let one breath of static stand for everything she could not put in the log. He says the structure is an unsurveyed void with an active anomaly, and the only numbers he trusts are the ones from before it opened. Dane, he's not going to count anything that happens inside that thing. As far as Heskel Drum is concerned, you went off the books the moment the door shut behind you. Tovan took the handset. He heard his own voice come out level. Rescue lead. This is Reth. Inform the director that the second chair of the reliquary survey is inside the find, that the find is a functioning structure of the vanished builders under power, and that a mass driver charge at the core bore will flood it with the full head of the aquifer. He will not only be drowning 6 souls, he will be destroying the single most significant archaeological site in Kale history. Dr. Vire said, I will quote you word for word, but you should know the response that's already on file. The director has ruled the activation a hazard event, not a find event. His words in the log, structures do not open. Therefore, whatever has opened is not the structure. The sentence sat in the warm amber air of the round room, perfectly formed, and Tavan recognized its parentage with a precision that hurt. It was his doctrine, cited cleanly, applied honestly, by an administrator doing everything right by the book. And the book was wrong, and the man who wrote the book was standing inside the evidence, listening to his own logic load a charge over his head. Vire, he said quietly, fight him. Until they take the handset off me, Vire said. Climb fast, surface out. Third chamber was a stair, the dark stair, Sully named it afterward, and the name stuck to the survey literature forever. A tight helical climb cored through the structure's spine, treads cut child shallow, the ceiling low enough that Dane and Imka carried the stretcher at a crouch. The amber veins ran up its walls like a handrail of light. 9 meters up, the light went out. All of it at once, the veins, the seam glow above and below, even the green telltales on their own suit collars, smothered to nothing. And the dark that took its place was not the absence of light, but a presence of it, a black with depth and texture, total beyond anything a working life underground had ever shown any of them. Tavan heard the stretcher stop, heard 5 sets of breathing change gear. Nobody moved, Dane said, calm, close, bodiless, stretchers level, sound off and reach, find a shoulder, find a strap, we chain up. Imka, I've got Bren's rail. Bren, still heavy apparently, Sully. I've got Imka's pack and got the doctor's sleeve. Tobin managed. A small hand closed on his wrist, certain in the dark, and dragged his glove to a strap. Silence where the 6th voice should have been Pilo. Dane said, sound off. What came back was breathing, high, fast, sawtooth, the unmistakable rhythm of a mind coming off its rails. Kale are not built for true dark. Their 4th eye never fully closes, and a blackness this complete reads to the hindbrain as burial. Tavan knew the physiology, knowing it did nothing. He heard his recordist begin to claw at his own collar seals somewhere below, heard the boy's boots scrape as he turned again, lost the stair entirely in a dark with no edges. Pilo. Tavan put 11 years of second chair authority into it. Recordist. Report. It bounced off the panic like a seal off a builder door. Authority. Again answering nothing. It was Sully who let go of Tovin's sleeve. He felt her hand leave, heard her move down 2 treads by feel toward the broken breathing. 15 years old in absolute blackness on an open spiral stair, and she did not grab the boy, and she did not order him. She sat down on the tread beside him, found his hand, pressed it flat to her own collar where the pulse beat slow, and started counting out loud. 1, 2, 3. Stairs don't move, Pilo. 4. We're on stairs, that's all. 5. Count with me. My gran taught me this in the storm cellars. You count and the dark gets bored. 6. A ragged breath. Then half a tone too high, informal register, heartbreaking. S7. 8. They said together. The others took it up without being told. Bren's voice from the stretcher, then Imka, then Dane. The count rolling up and down the invisible stair, deliberate as a work gang rhythm, 6 voices weaving one rope of sound in the dark for the 2 who needed it. Tovan heard himself counting in high Kale and did not stop. At 26, Pilo's breathing found the cadence. At 30, it held. At 31, the amber came back, not all at once, but tread by tread, climbing the spiral with the count, as though the house were joining in, and Tovan Reth, blinking in the bloom of light with his recordist's hand still pressed to a human child's collar, understood that the dark had been a door too. There had never been a lock on this stair. There had been a question. The same question, he began to suspect, that every chamber of this house had been built to ask, the question his entire discipline had spent 300 years answering with the wrong. Noun. Not, who are you? Not, what do you carry? Who carries whom? Everyone whole? Dane's voice, even now, doing its public arithmetic. Then we climb. Sully, good work. Gran's trick, Sully said, pulling Pilo up by the hand. The dark gets bored. Come on, recordist. You can count my steps. It's 81 to the top. I read the wall. She had read the wall. That fact chimed somewhere deep in Tovin's chest, under the adrenaline, and on the climb he finally let himself look, properly look, at the script that ran beside the amber handrail vein, the script his catalogs called ornamental lock cipher. Numbers first. He could see it now that he had watched her do it, the 5 and strike tally underlying the digit forms, base 10 positional. And beside the numbers, in the worn compact lettering repeated at every fifth tread, two short words he had photographed on a dozen worlds and filed under decorative paired glyphs, function unknown. He stopped on tread 60. The party climbed past him. He took out his field slate with hands not quite steady, called up the comparison plates from the human contract paperwork he had processed without reading for 2 years, the shipping labels, the equipment manifests, the safety placards the laborers posted in their own low trade script around the site, and held a manifest label beside the wall of the vanished builders. The paired glyphs on the wall said, "Hold on, human script, old, drifted, pruned by 10,000 years of distance, but human script, the way a keel is a tree. The literature's bedrock, no descendant population, no linguistic continuity, builders vanished without issue, cracked through the middle in the amber light of a stairwell. And what stood in the crack was a 15-year-old dig runner 2 turns above him, chattering tread counts to a frightened kale boy in the language of the people who built the house. "Doctor," Dane's voice from above. "You stalled?" Tovan Reth put the slate away. His voice, when it came, surprised him. It was younger than it had been in years. "The builders," he said, climbing. "Survey lead. Dane, the builders are not vanished." "Sir, they're on the payroll," Tovan said, and laughed once. A short, cracked sound with 11 years of doctrine in it breaking up, and climbed past the stretcher to the head of the stair, where the 4th door was already opening on a room full of shelves. They called it the provision room in the report, because that is what it was, and no one ever found a better word for the feeling of walking into it. It was long and low and warm, ribbed like the hold of a ship, and the shelves ran in bays down both sides, stocked. Not ruined, not dusty relics of stocked the way a well-run store is stocked, sealed containers in graded sizes with pictographic labels, racked tools with their handles worn from use and their edges kept, coils of line, folded sheets of something between cloth and foil, and at child height down every bay, small bins of small things, fasteners, whistles, fire strikers, carved tokens with holes for a cord. The amber veins ran along the shelf rails. The air moved here faintly for the first time since the collapse. A slow, clean current with a mineral taste, and the suit collars read it, and one by one stood down to stand by, and that alone nearly undid them all. Breathable air, made and moved by the house, 10,000 years after its builders walked away. "Scrubber clocks just stopped mattering," Imka said, staring at her collar light. "Dane, the air clock is gone. The house pays for our air now. The water clock isn't gone." Dane nodded at the wall by the door, where the depth gauge glyph kept its patient count. The notch had climbed past 1/3 of its scale. Below them, Bore 9 and the round room of the fountain were going under, chamber by chamber, and the charge in the core bore did not care what the house paid for. "Hour count, 9 and change to detonation," Imka said. "If Vire can't stop him." Bren needed the rest regardless. They set the stretcher down in the center bay, and Imka redressed the leg with their own kit while Suli ranged the shelves with the lamp, calling out fines, and Pilo had begun, somewhere on the stair, to record things in a different order. Tovan noticed it before he understood it. The boy's lens lingered not on artifacts but on usage. Suli's hands sorting fasteners, Dane recoiling a builder line to test its lay, the worn handles, the mended places. He was recording the room the way Suli had read the wall, as a place people had worked, as testimony, not inventory. "Dr. Reth." Pilo's voice was low, the doctrine of standing. "When we file this," he hesitated, the lens steady on the child height bins. "There is no protocol heading for any of this." "What do I call the room?" "Call it what it is," Tovan said. "Provisions, kept ready. Write what you see, recordist. The headings will have to grow." What Suli found at the end of the last bay was the thing that turned the room from shelter into question. A sled. It sat in a launching cradle of amber-veined rail that ran from the room's far wall up into a smooth board shaft, angled steep toward the surface, lit faintly from within like the throat of a lamp. The sled was the size of a freight pallet, walled, padded along its bed with the cloth-foil sheeting, and its rail hummed very softly under the hand, live and ready and going up. Stenciled on its side, in the worn compact lettering of the builders, were figures and a number. Tovan read it twice to be sure, then a third time because being sure helped nothing. 3. The sled was rated plainly and pictographically for 3. "Up shaft," Dane said quietly. He had his palm flat on the rail's hum. "That's a launch rail. That's a way out right now for 3. Nobody said anything. The water gauge ticked up another graduation in the silence, and the silence got teeth. "Bren goes," Imka said. "That's not a discussion. Bren and Suli," "I'm not Suli," started, furious. "You're 15, stop." Dane didn't raise his voice, but the room stopped. He stood with his hand on the rail a moment longer, then turned and looked at his crew. At Bren Gray on the stretcher, at Imka with Bren's blood dried on her gloves and her collar still buddy-lined to his, at Suli with a builder fire striker clenched in her fist, at the two Kale at the bay's end, whom the sled's number had carefully not exempted, and Tovin watched the young man's face go through the arithmetic, and come out the far side somewhere arithmetic doesn't go. Dr. Dane said, "You're the reader now. Read me the sled." Tovin came down the bay slowly. The stencil figures, three-seated forms, the rail, the rising line of the shaft, and beneath the stencil, struck deep and deliberate into the sled's flank. Not stenciled, but carved by hand. The strokes patient and emphatic, the way you cut a thing you mean to outlast you. Ran one more line of the builder's script. He had the trick of the script now. The tally bones under the letter forms, the pruned old trade words, Sully's storm cellar cadence in his ear. He read it through once silently. Then he read it aloud, in the amber light, in the house of the people who were not vanished, and his voice was not entirely level, and he never afterward pretended it had been. It says, all of you, or none of you. The hum of the rail filled the room like held breath. It's not a way out, Imka said at last softly. It's the question again. It's the same question. Tovan's own words came up out of him as if someone older were lending them. It has been the same question since the roof fell. Every door in this house is the same door. Then the sled carries gear, Dane said, and just like that the teeth went out of the silence. He started lashing points along the sled's walls with the builder line, fast, decided. A man spending a decision the instant it was minted so no one could put it back. Bren rides the bed. That's not favoritism. That's freight physics. Provisions, water from the next fountain if we find one. The doctor's case, everything rides, everybody walks. The shaft's bored smooth, but look, he aimed the lamp. Shallow treads climbed beside the rail the whole visible length of the throat. They cut stairs next to their own railway. They cut stairs next to everything. The house was never going to let three of us buy out the other three. We climbed beside it. The house carries what cannot walk, Pilo said suddenly, in his formal register, like a man quoting a text that did not exist yet, and walks beside what it carries. He looked down, embarrassed. For the record, a description. That's the heading, Tovan said quietly. Recordist, that one's the heading. They loaded the sled. And it was while they were loading it. Tovan stowing his sample case in the cradle of foilcloth, which the house had rated worth carrying, though it had rated his seals worth nothing, that the relay woke up again, unasked, at full clarity, and the voice that came out of it was not Osavires. Occupants of the anomaly, this is Director Heskel Drum. Dane's hands kept lashing. Everyone else went still. You are inside an unsurveyed void exhibiting active behavior of unknown origin, the director said. He had a fine voice for committees, dry and even, every clause pre-weighed. Standing doctrine, Reth's own doctrine, I will note, establishes that vanished structures do not open. I am therefore proceeding on the only safe assumption, that the void you occupy is a hazard formation mimicking access, and that the activation event is a threat behavior. The breach charge will fire at our Fortin as authorized. If, as rescue lead Vire insists, you are climbing, then climb. The charge is your rescue. The flood will be brief and the recovery teams are staged. This channel will remain open for your acknowledgement. For a moment, nobody trusted themselves to speak, and so the first reply Heskel Drum received from inside the find was Bren Calder's laugh, weak and wet and entirely sincere, from a stretcher being lashed to a 10,000-year-old freight sled. Director, Bren said, I've been rescued twice today, and both times it was a human with an air hose or a house with a staircase. You'll forgive me if I don't rate your charge third. Identify yourself, this is Reth. Tavan had the handset. The room's amber light lay along his arm like a hand. Director, hear me once. I am standing in a provisioned hold, breathing air this structure is manufacturing for us. Beside a cargo rail, its builders rated and posted in their own script. Script, Director, with living dissent. I will transmit the comparison plates, and I am telling you, as the author of the doctrine you are citing, the doctrine is wrong. I wrote it from the outside of locked doors. I am on the inside now, and the inside is not a hazard formation. It is a rescue in progress, and it is older and better at this than both of us. Hold your charge. The pause was long enough to hope through. Dr. Reth, Drum said, with real regret, which was the terrible thing about the man. It was real. You have been in a collapse in the dark and low air for half a day. You are the last voice in that void I can treat as evidence. Hour 14. Acknowledge. The channel clicked to standby without waiting for the acknowledgement, which told them what the open channel was actually for. Not for their voices to reach the surface. For the surface to have it on record that it had warned them. Imka very carefully did not throw the handset. She set it in its cradle on the sled and stood with both hands flat on the sled wall, and said to nobody in particular, He's going to kill us with my own air margin. He's using the math from the pocket. We sent him new math an hour ago, and he ruled it inadmissible. He ruled the house inadmissible, Tovan said. The shame of it sat in his chest. Fully owned now. Because I taught the entire survey that nothing true ever happens on the far side of a builder door. He is not mad, And he is not cruel. He is doctrine, executing cleanly. He looked up at the upshaft, the long-lit throat rising toward a man who would not count anything that happened inside it. 300 years from now, recordists will study this hour as the cost of a bad sentence written by a careful man. Climb, we answer him by arriving. The shaft was 81 treads to the next chamber. Sully counted aloud the whole way for Pilo, who counted with her in 2 scripts now and only shook a little. And the sled climbed beside them on its hum of amber rail, pacing them exactly, never once pulling ahead of the slowest walker. And Tovin filed that detail where he was filing everything now. The house does not let the carried outrun the carrying. Bren rode with his eyes open, watching the rail light slide past, and somewhere past tread 50 he said to the ceiling, conversationally. My grandmother's grandmother was Vask-born. Did anybody know that? Contract registry has it. The first labor draft, the waterworks. Before the Kale surveys ever, he breathed anyway. Probably half the roster has a line back to the old colony. We never made anything of it. It was just where the work was. The old colony failed, Tovan said carefully. The record shows an evacuation, incomplete. The record shows, Bren agreed, dry as the Dead Sea above them. Doctor, you're learning. At tread 63, the rail died. It happened without drama, which made it worse. The sled's hum simply stopped. The amber vein along the shaft wall guttered, and across a span of 4 meters above them, the light failed entirely, and in the dead span, for the first time since the antechamber, they saw the house wounded. A crack ran through the knotstone, hairline at its ends, a finger wide at its heart, climbing diagonally across the shaft wall and the rail bed both, and around it, the material had gone gray and ordinary-looking, like living tissue gone to scar. That's new, Imka said quietly. That's today. That's our collapse. We cracked it. The shelf failure didn't just bury us. It hit the structure. The house did then what the house always did. Beside the dead span, the wall cleared, and a gauge assembles itself. Not the flood this time. A section drawing of the house's own flank, the crack picked out in sober gray, and beside it a small constellation of load figures in builder's tally. It was posting its injury, plainly without alarm, the way a skipper reports a sprung plank to the crew because the crew has a right to the truth of the hull. The patient house told the 6 people inside it. I am hurt here. Account for it. Can it heal? Sully asked. It's 10,000 years old and it just spent the morning opening doors for us, Dane said. He was already unlashing the stretcher. It doesn't owe us healing on a schedule. The sled can't cross dead rail. So we carry. Bren goes hand over hand up the treads, full lift all 6. Doctor, you have the front left. Pilo, he looked at the boy, made a decision, and Tovin watched him make it. You call the count. 2 scripts. Keep us in step on the narrow bit. Pilo Vess, who 6 hours earlier had clawed at his own collar in the dark, took position ahead of the dead span and called the lift in trade script in high Kale, steady as a metronome, while 5 of them took Bren Calder's weight up 4 meters of broken stair past the wound their own morning had cut. It was ugly, slow, knee-deep, careful work. The crack breathed grit at them. Bren made one joke at the midpoint and nobody had the air to laugh at it. At the top, where the vein woke again and the rail hummed back to life, they relashed the sled with their hands shaking in the fine, honest way of spent muscle, and the house, as they stepped past the last of the scar, brightened the rail light a degree under the sled. Taking the weight back, Tovin thought, saying, I have him again, well held. The relay chose that moment to carry the surface down to them once more, and what it carried was an argument. Not a request, Director. It's the roster's own time. Off-shift volunteer, Vidra's voice hard denied. Drum, even, pre-weighed. Hand-digging an active spoil field is how 6 casualties become 40. The roster will stand down behind the wire and the charge timeline stands. That's the end of the discussion. Then for the log, said a third voice, older female. Flat with the particular calm of someone who has spent decades being underestimated near heavy equipment, and Tavan saw the humans glance at each other. The steward, the contract labor roster of the Lantern site, formally notes that there are 6 souls in the ground and 400 pairs of hands behind that. Wire, and that the wire is doctrine and the hands are not. The roster will be standing at the wire, Director. The whole roster. The night shift's already there. You can log us in the morning. The channel cut. Bren grinned up at the shaft ceiling, gray-faced, soaked in everyone's sweat. That's the kettle rule, he said to no one into the house. You take the last cup, you fill the pot. They'll come for us by hand if it gets to that, Doctor. Across a live spoil field. Write that in your doctrine. It is no longer my doctrine, Tovan said, taking up his pole, but I will write it. At the top of the shaft, the 5th door stood already open. The house had stopped making them earn doors, Tovan realized, somewhere around the stair. Or rather, the climbing itself, the carrying itself, was the earning, continuous and sufficient, and beyond it lay a chamber that silenced even Sully. It was a gallery. A long vaulted room with bays of honey-colored light, and in each bay a pedestal, and on the pedestals, nothing. Hundreds of pedestals, each one carved with a shallow waiting recess shaped to hold something, each one empty, each one lit anyway, the way you leave a lamp on for someone who has not come home. Down the gallery's center ran a low stone bench, child-polished at the edges, and at its far end, before the last door, a door taller and plainer than any they had passed, stood a wall of names. Tavan knew it was names before he could read a single one. Some shapes are names in any script. They were cut in columns, hundreds of them, in the builder's compact hand, and below each name was a small recess like the pedestal's recesses, and a handful of the recesses held things. A carved token on a cord, a fire striker, worn out, a child's 5-and-strike tally scratched on a chip of slate. "It's a cloakroom," Imka whispered, at the gallery's mouth. "All these empty shelves. It's where you put down what you're carrying before." She looked at the tall, plain door, "before whatever that is." "It's a harbor," Dane said slowly. "Pedestals are berths. You leave what you don't need for the crossing. It's both." Sully had walked ahead down the bench, lamp low, and stopped before the wall of names, and her voice, when it came back to them, was very young and very steady, which is a combination that commands more silence than either alone. "And it's a waiting list, Doctor. Come read this. Come read what's over the names." Tavan came down the gallery. Above the columns of names, in letters larger and deeper than any script he had yet seen in the house, deliberate as law, ran a single line. He stood before it with his 4 eyes and his ruined doctrine and his case of seals nobody had asked for, and he read it first silently, and then, because they were waiting and because it deserved air, aloud. It says, "The house waited for them." He swallowed. The amber light hummed. "The names are children," he said. "Everyone carries the small form suffix. The recesses are for their tokens, the tokens they were each given, I think, when they were enrolled for." His finger moved along the carved line below, translating, no longer doubting his own readings. The script as plain to him now as the doctrine had once been for the last crossing, the evacuation, the incomplete evacuation. He looked down the columns at the few filled recesses, the hundreds of empty ones, and the arithmetic of it arrived in his chest like cold water finding a channel. The filled ones boarded early ferries. The empty ones were still to come. This gallery is the muster roll of the children who never arrived, and the house, which had counted 6 heads under a falling roof. The house which posted the flood depth where its passengers could see it. The house which lit rooms before strangers entered so they would not be afraid, and walked its sled at the speed of the slowest walker, and had kept these berths lit for 10,000 years. "The house is still waiting for them," Tovan finished, and discovered that a Kale of his standing could, after all, weep in the field, and that not one member of the contract labor roster thought less of him for it. It was Sully who broke the gallery's spell, because it was Sully the gallery had been quietly working on the whole time. She had gone down the wall of names with her lamp held close, tread by tread, the way she counted stairs, and at the 3rd column from the door she stopped and stood very still, and then said, in a voice that had decided to be matter-of-fact and was losing the vote, "Dane, there's a 10 on the wall." They gathered. The name sat halfway down its column, cut in the builder's compact hand, the small form suffix curled at its end like a held hand. A child's name, and the family name under it was the same shape, older, drifted, but the same bones as the name stitched on the dig runner's coveralls standing in front of it. Beneath it, the token recess was empty, one of the hundreds, one of the never arrived. "Could be coincidence," Sully said. "Names repeat." "Vassborn?" Bren said quietly, from the sled. "First labor draft. Half the roster, kid. I told you. My gran used to say we were from here, way back. Before the work was." Sully's hand hovered an inch from the carved name, not touching. "Everyone's gran says that kind of thing. You don't think it's true?" Tavan looked at the girl in front of the muster roll, the girl who had read the tally at first sight, who had counted a Kale boy through the dark with a trick out of her family's storm cellars, who had walked into a builder structure and treated every miracle in it as somebody's reasonable workmanship, and the last timber of the old doctrine went over without a sound, not vanished, never vanished. Scattered, drafted, renamed, paid by the hour to dig up their own great-grandmother's front steps, and so thoroughly written out of consideration that the second chair of the reliquary survey had processed their employment forms without once reading the script they were written in. "The evacuation went somewhere," he said. "Evacuations do. Off-world, the record says, and the record stops because the record was ours, and we stopped keeping it because nothing about a refugee labor pool seemed worth a reliquary's attention." He heard his own discipline indict itself, clause by clause, and let it. 10,000 years is 400 generations, Sulitan. The house's children didn't vanish either. They got on other ferries. They became the galaxy's freight handlers and hull cutters and dig runners. And some of them came home holding the shovel, and nobody told them because nobody knew. We dated this structure. We never once dated the workforce. It was Pilo who found the stele. It stood apart from the wall of names, waist high in the shadow of the tall plain door, easy to miss, deliberately modest, the way a signature is smaller than the letter, and unlike every other surface in the house, which had been built and finished and meant, the stele was workaday stone from the old seabed, and the script on it had been cut by hand in haste, by someone whose strokes wobbled exactly the way the children's tallies wobbled, because hands wobble when the ground will not stop moving. Doctor, Pilo said, this one isn't architecture, this one's a message. Tavan read it the way you take a letter from a dead hand, gently, and all the way through, and aloud, because the people it concerned were standing behind him. It is the keeper's hand, he said. The house's last keeper. It is dated. He worked the tally. The system was second nature now, the night of the basin quake. It says, the sea took the high road at dusk. The convoy from the east shore is not come. 400 small ones and their wardens, last signaled at the Narrows. The house calls, and they do not answer. I am taking the spare lamps in the strong hands and going out to the Narrows to find them and walk them in. I have entered my token so the house will know. The crew is out, not gone. House, if I am long, hold the door warm, keep the cups full, light the berths. They will be tired when they come. Some will come carried. Open for the carrying, as you were built to do. Never mind their names. The dark out there is no respecter of lists. I will knock when I knock. And then one line more added after. The strokes are worse. The quake was worse. It says, going now. The water is loud on the road. Be patient, old friend, be patient. The gallery was very quiet. She entered her token, Sully said at last thickly, so the house would wait. She pointed. They had walked past it twice. Beside the steles, a single recess adult height filled, one worn carved token on a cord gone to dust. It's been holding the door for her for 10,000 years, because she told it to. Open for the carrying. Never mind their names. Dane stood looking at the wobbled strokes for a long moment, and his voice came out careful. That's why we got in. That's the standing order. Not bloodline, not species. She struck names off the requirement with the ground coming apart under her, because she didn't know who'd be doing the carrying by the time anyone came, and she didn't care. He looked up the tall, plain door toward whatever waited beyond it. The house didn't choose us, Doctor. It obeyed her. It's been obeying her since the night it lost everything, last order standing. Then the doctrine of standing was wrong twice, Tavan said quietly. Nothing in this galaxy was sealed. It was all of it, every door of it, held open. To the only password its builders trusted to outlive their language, their colony, and their names. He copied the stele entire with his own hands into his field slate, and his strokes were not much steadier than the keeper's. 400 small ones and their wardens at the Narrows. East Shore. Recordist, mark the bearing. When this is over, whatever else the survey does with its centuries, someone owes that road a search. Marked, Pilo said, cited ode. Years later, the survey that followed that bearing into the deep basin would vindicate the marking past. Anything Sarah Hall dared print in a first edition. But that night they knew only the stele and the bearing and the debt. The gallery hummed. Somewhere below them, water was climbing through rooms that had given them air and light and answers. And somewhere above, a careful man was watching a clock. But the gallery insisted gently on its own moment, and Tavan had one more thing to do in it. He took his case to the nearest empty pedestal. The seals of 9 institutions, the charter plate, the authorship medallion, 11 years of documented standing, the entire portable proof of Tovan Reth, and he laid the case open in the carved recess, which fitted, of course, because the recess had been cut to hold whatever a traveler chose to set down. He was not fully sure what he meant by it until it was done, and then he was. A man at the start of a crossing, leaving on the shelf the thing he would not need on the water. The pedestal's bay brightened around the case, honey gold, accepting the berth. And the tall, plain door at the gallery's end, the door with no glyphs at all, the door that had stood shut past the wall of names this whole time, broke its seam from top to bottom and swung wide. Huh, Bren said. The door fees your resume. Dane was looking at Tovan with an expression the other. Tovan corrected himself. He had stopped feeling old an hour ago. The other 5 had not worn before. Something that in a younger discipline might have been called respect, and in this one was simply being counted. The fee's the weight. You can't carry that in a stretcher pole. That, Tavan said, is what I meant, and took the front left pole, and they went through the tall door together, all of them, or none of them, with the sled humming behind. The chamber beyond the tall door was a shaft, and the shaft was a well. It rose sheer and round 20 meters across, walled in the patient, not stone, and its throat went up farther than the lamps could say. There was no stair this time. There were no treads, no rail, no rungs. A wide platform of the amber vein material stood flush with the floor at the chamber's center, ringed by a low rim, with cleats and lashing points and long-worn grab bars set at every height a hand might need one. And across the platform's deck, in letters a meter tall, struck deep, ran the two words Tavan had photographed on a dozen worlds and filed under function unknown. Hold on. I don't love this room, Imka said. The depth gauge by the entry told them why the room existed. Its notch stood at over half scale now, and as they watched, the tall door swung itself shut behind the sled and sealed, and a new gauge woke beside the first, this one local. This one for here. And from the base of the well's walls, all around them, in perfect calm, the water came in. Pilo made a sound. Sully had his hand before the sound finished. Stairs don't move, she said. Count with me. It's the house, Dane said, loud and level. Over the rising hiss. Look at it. Look at the rate. That's not a breach. That's a fill valve. Metered. The house doesn't do anything to us it hasn't posted first. He slapped the meter-tall letters under his boots. It posted. It's a lock, a canal lock like the water works topside. There's no stair because the stair is the water. Lash the sled, get aboard. Hold on. The flood is the ferry, Tavan said half to himself, with the specific vertigo of a man watching 10,000 years of misfiled terror reorganize into infrastructure. Every survey report on every drowned builder shaft on every water world. Flood-trapped hazard sealed by inundation. Every one of them he would bet his abandoned medallion, a locked chamber standing ready, read by scholars who had never once arrived at it carrying someone they got aboard. The platform took the sled, the stretcher, 6 lives in their lashings, and the water took the platform, smooth as a hand under a tray, no lurch, no spin, the rim shedding the current in a steady hem of white, and the well of the patient house lifted them up its own throat at the pace of a freight elevator with a sleeping child aboard. Amber veins lit in the walls as they rose, pacing them, and the water below glowed faintly where the platform had been, as if the house were leaving a lamp on behind them out of habit. Bren watched the walls slide down past the sled, his head pillowed on a coil of builder line, and said to the well in general, I have been hauled by cranes with worse manners. Mark this, Tavan said to Pilo, who was recording the water line with his free hand white-knuckled on a grab bar. Hour 11 from the collapse. We are riding the aquifer. The hazard is the vehicle. Note that the house is used in sequence, our own care, our own water, our own voices, our own legs, and now the very flood that was killing us. And it has wasted nothing, and it has asked us for nothing it did not first show us how to give. He paused. The platform rose. Note also that the doctrine of standing would have charged this room as a death trap, and the doctrine of standing is hereby withdrawn by its author. Cite the well, Pilo said. His voice shook and his lens did not. That was when the relay came alive of its own accord, the house carrying the channel to them again attentively, the way it carried everything. And the voice on it was Osaviri's, and it had stopped being careful. Bore 9, surface, priority. Drums moved it up. Placement crew cleared the core bore ahead of schedule. His modelers flagged aquifer instability. That's your lock filling. His instruments can see the water moving, and he's reading it as the collapse going critical. Detonation's been advanced to hour 12. Static took a breath. That's under an hour. I've filed protest. I've filed countermodels. The human stewards filed a labor action. Half this camp is standing at the wire over the bore, and he's citing every one of us into the log, and the clock is still running. Tell me where you are. Tell me exactly. Dane looked up the well's throat into the dark above the amber and did arithmetic out loud one more time. We're in a flooded lift shaft inside the structure, rising, maybe 40 meters below the old seabed surface, and we can't steer, brake, or get off, he said. Our position in one word, committed. Then I need the thing I called to ask. Veyer's voice came down half a register, the way voices do when they get to the cargo. The director's evidence problem. He won't count anything from inside the find. Your voices are duress testimony. The doctor's report is compromised. My models are advocacy. But his own instruments aren't inside the find. If that structure can show itself on the surface arrays, anything, a power signature, a ground displacement his own seismographs have to log, then it stops being testimony and starts being data, and I can walk into the command tent and rule the site, occupied by an active unknown, on his own feet. It's the only key that fits his lock. Can the house? And Tovan heard the moment Osavire, rescue lead, career engineer, gave up pretending she was talking about a void. Can the house make itself seen? Silence on the platform, except the steady white hem of the water. Rescue lead, Devan said slowly. We will ask it. He had not meant the words to sound liturgical. They sounded liturgical. And it was only after they were out of his mouth that he understood the practical problem, stacked inside them like a charge. In a bore. In 11 hours the house had answered acts. Only acts. Care, trust, burden, the laying down of weight. It had never once answered a request, a credential, or a word. He had no idea asking even was to the patient house. None of them did. The platform rose. The water gleamed. Overhead, somewhere beyond the amber, the last door of the house was waiting, and beyond it, a man with a clean conscience and a counting error, his thumb above the key, 1,100 meters of patience between them and the dawn. 40 minutes, Imka said quietly, watching the relay's clock like a gauge. Whatever the last room wants from us, we'd better be quick about giving it. The water delivered them the way water does everything in a well-built lock, completely and without comment. The platform came flush with a stone lip, the current stilled, the rim's white hem fell silent, and they stood at the threshold of the highest room of the patient house, with the flood lying calm and lamplit behind them, a tamed sea in a stone throat. The last door was not tall, and it was not grand. It was the smallest door in the house. Dane had to stoop, the sled barely cleared, and Tavan understood it before he was through it. Every other door in the house was sized for crowds and cargo, and this one was sized for a child, because this room had been built around the people it was for. The heart of the house was a bridge. Not a throne room, not a sanctum, not a vault. A bridge, low, round, warm-lit, ringed by sloped consoles of honeystone at heights between Suli's waist and Suli's chin, with handholds worn to silk and seats scaled like school furniture. The amber veins of the whole structure gathered here, running up the walls and over the domed ceiling to a single keel line of light that ran the room's full diameter, fore to aft. And it was fore to aft. The room had a bow. The entire patient architecture of the place aligned itself in the body's compass the moment you stood at the rail, and what it said in every line was not temple, but vessel. On the aft wall, where a crew coming aboard would see it first, the builders had written the ship's name. Tavan read it aloud, and his voice handled it the way you hand down something that has been on a high shelf for 10,000 years. The last ferry. It's a school bus, Imka said, half-lawing, wet-eyed, her hand on a child height rail. 40 meters of miracle, and it's the bus. It's a lifeboat drill, Dane said quietly. He turned in the bowlight. Every room. The fountain teaches you to pool. The stair teaches you to count off in the dark. The provisions teach you to load all or none. The gallery teaches you to set down weight, and the lock teaches you to trust the crossing. It's not a gauntlet, and it never was a tomb. It's a curriculum. You walk up this house, and by the time you reach the bridge, he looked around at the five of them, dusty, bloodied, buddy-lined, carrying each other's hours. You're not passengers anymore. That's the trick of it. That's the whole trick. It couldn't save them unless they crewed it. So the house itself was built to turn whoever climbs it into a crew. Then the children who never came, Pilo began softly, had crew waiting for them the whole way up. Bren's voice was thin now, the long day pulling at it, but it carried. 10,000 years and the recess lights still on. Somebody build me a word for that. Patience, Suli said is the word, and it was while she said it, Pilo's lens caught this. The framed Sarah Hall would one day hang 4 stories tall in the reliquary's entrance arch, that the bridge of the last ferry, hearing voices at its consoles for the first time since its world died, woke the manifest. The bow console lit from within. Its sloped face cleared like ice going to water, and beneath the surface rose ranks of small recesses, token berths, the same hand-cut shape as the gallery walls, but these arranged in crew stations, 6 forward, then dozens, then hundreds, station after station fading aft into the stone's amber depth, the watchbill of a vessel built to carry a colony's children and crewed, on its last scheduled voyage by no one. Above the 6 forward berths, deep-cut and patient, stood a line of the builder's script. It says, Tavan read, and had to take a breath in the middle. Who do you carry? Not who are you? Not even now. Not at the bridge, not at the bow, not at the final word of the entire curriculum. His whole science had knelt at the galaxy's doors, asking, do you know who I am? And the doors had been waiting, all of them on every world, for any voice at all to answer the only question their builders had thought worth carving. 40 minutes is 31, Imka said gently. How do we answer? Not with words, Dane said. It's never once been words. He was already moving. Turkins, the provision bins, Suli. Suli was holding hers up before he finished. The carved token on its cord she'd pocketed 3 chambers down, swiped from a child height bin with a dig runner's reflex, and carried since like a question she wasn't ready to ask. One by one the rest produced what the house had quietly armed them with hours ago. Bren's fire striker, Imka's whistle, the fastener Pilo had recorded and then, recording it, palmed, Dane's coil and a builder line, and Tovan, who had left 11 years of standing on a pedestal below, found in his thigh pocket the one human-made thing he owned. Suli's spare striker, pressed on him at the fountain, In case the dark comes back, Doctor. You don't put in your own, Sully said suddenly. Certainly, reading the watchbill's grammar the way she read everything in this house, at sight, from the inside, that's the answer. That's the whole answer. Who do you carry? You enter somebody else. So they crewed the last ferry the way the builders had meant it to be crewed since the day its keel light first lit, each setting a token in a berth and speaking aloud the name of someone else. Imka entered Bren, flat on his sled, who could not stand at a console. Bren, propped on one elbow with a striker, entered Imka. Buddy lines a circuit runs both ways. Dane entered Sully. Pilo entered. In careful Transcript syllables he had learned on a dark stair, Sully's gran, who taught the counting, and the bridge accepted the dead woman's name into a berth, as though patience ran in both directions through time, which, in that house, it did. Tavan entered Pilo, his recordist, his witness, the first Kale in history to file decency under its correct heading, and Sully Tan last stood before the sixth berth with her token and did not enter any of them. She turned to the aft wall, toward the gallery far below with its columns of small form names, and she spoke clearly, in the builder's tongue, and then in standard so every record would carry it twice. I entered the children of the muster roll. All of them. They never got to board. I'm boarding them. She set her token home. The last ferry answered. Light went down through the house like a struck cord. Every vein, every chamber, every tread and rail and recess of it igniting at once. Fountain to bridge, and the 6 forward berths flared, and then the dozens behind them, and then the hundreds, station after station filling with light as 10,000 years of held breath let go, the empty watchbill of the dead colony lighting itself complete from a single child's proxy, and through the stone, felt in the bones of the feet and the boards of the chest before it was heard, came a voice. Not assembled, not borrowed, not mimicking anyone's dead or living. Low, vast, careful with its own power, the voice of a house that had listened to 400 generations of weather and one long day of humans being human, speaking the builder's tongue in words simple enough for the smallest of its intended crew. 6 came, all carry. Confirmed, Dane whispered, like a man answering a roll. Crew acknowledged, said the patient house. Rise. The keel light surged. Somewhere below, vaster than the lock, pumps the size of streets woke in the foundation dark, and the calm sea in the well began to work, and the entire 40-meter house of the dead colony's patients shrugged off 10,000 years of seabed and began, with no more violence than the lock platform's lift, to climb. The bridge windows woke for the voyage. They had taken the bow wall for solid stone, until it cleared, panel by panel, into a lens of honey light, and the crew of the last ferry watched their own road home fall away beneath them. The house rose through its own body's history, past the gallery, where the wall of names burned now in full column, every berth alight, the keeper's small steely glowing softest of all, past the dead span on the 81-tread shaft, where, as the keel light surged, they saw the gray scar of the morning's crack flood slowly amber from both ends, the house mending itself at last, spending its waking strength on its own hull, now that its passengers no longer needed every jewel of it. Past the provision room, shelves swaying gently, secured, ship-shape, 10,000 years of readiness riding out its first sea day since the colony fell, and past the fountain. The round room had gone under hours ago. The lens showed it drowned deep, green, dark, lost, except that the channels still ran amber beneath the flood, every carved cup still glowing along the walls like a harbor seen from a night ship, and Sully pressed her palm flat to the lens and said, fiercely, to the drowned room that had taught them the kettle rule, "We'll come back and bail you out, crew's word." The house rang once softly beneath their feet. Logged, the tone said. Witnessed, held to. It's drinking the flood. Imka reported from the depth gauge, disbelieving her own reading aloud. Look at the rate. It's not just outrunning the water, it's taking it aboard. Ballast. The aquifer's been chasing us all day, and the house is going to surface with the whole weapon in its hold. She laughed once, unsteady. Drum's flood model just became cargo. Mark the principle, Tovan said to Pilo. He could not seem to stop. 11 hours of doctrine collapsing had left a man-shaped space that only findings could fill. The house wastes nothing. Not water, not fear, not even the thing sent to kill it. Everything that arrives becomes provision. He watched the drowned fountain's lights slide down and away beneath them, a sinking constellation, and made the entry himself when Pilo's hands proved to be otherwise occupied holding the rail and trembling. Note also, the crew is in good order. The crossing is begun. The relay screamed into life on the sled, the house carrying the channel wide open now, both directions, indiscriminate, as though it wanted every voice aboard for this. And Asa Vire was shouting over a background of others shouting, reading it, the whole array's reading it, ground displacement across the entire site. It's not a collapse signature, it's coherent. It's 9. The seismographs are ringing like, what did you do? We answered the question, Dane said. Vire, get everyone off the wire. Clear the bore line, clear everything south of the old crane. Topside in, Doctor? Tovan was watching the depth gauge by the bridge door run backward. Graduation's falling away like years off his shoulders. At this rate of ascent, he said, 9 minutes. 9 minutes, Dane repeated. And Vire, the charge. The channel's background noise cut to one voice, dry and even, every clause pre-weighed, and the director of the lantern site spoke into the open line to the thing rising under his feet. This is Drum. Be advised that detonation authorization stands at hour 12. Whatever displacement event you have initiated does not. The patient house rang. There was no other word for it, and none was ever coined. It did not roar, did not quake. Rang. Once, the low architectural tone of every open door in its body struck together, a bell the size of a building sounding through 1,100 meters of rock and into every instrument, every boot sole, every breastbone on the surface of the Dead Sea. A sound that had been designed 10,000 years ago by parents engineering a ferry that might have to surface through a storm into a crowd of frightened families, and that would need, at the moment of its arrival, a voice that said in no language in all of them, children aboard, stand clear and stand down. On the bridge, the sound was almost gentle. On the surface, Pilo's remote feed recorded it arriving like the verdict of something very large that had been listening politely for 300 years. The line stayed open. They heard instruments wailing their calibration alarms. They heard 400 people go silent. They heard very close to the command tent's microphone the sound of a careful man's breath as the entire foundation of his doctrine rang under his feet like a struck glass. And then they heard Heskel Drum, administrator, in a voice from which every pre-weighed clause had fallen away, say 4 words his own log would preserve forever. Safe the charge. Everything. Safing the charge, Vire's voice answered, fierce and shaking. All stations, stand down, stand back, clear the seabed, bore 9, last ferry, whatever your name is, the ground's yours. Come up. For 4 minutes it was a triumph. The bridge thrummed, the gauges ran backward, the watch bill burned full, and the crew of 6 stood at their child-height consoles, feeling the planet give way overhead like a blanket being folded back. In the 5th minute, the house stopped. It did not falter, and it did not fall. It simply, with enormous control, ceased to rise, and the keelite's deep chord shifted, a tone lower, a degree of effort entering it that none of them had heard in any chamber, on any stair, in any lock. Then the bow console cleared a fresh panel of its honeystone, and the patient house did the thing it had done since the first hour of the collapse. The thing Tovan was beginning to understand was the deepest habit of its builder's whole civilization. It posted the problem where its passengers could see it. A light map assembled under the stone. The house in section, a tall, pale tower mid-climb. The seabed above. And at the house's northern flank, tangled in the path of a structure that had been given, by people now 10 millennia dead, exactly enough strength for one clean ascent, a knot of cold dead iron, the drill rig. 11 meters of swallowed kale machinery, plus the crane's old footing blocks, plus 80 meters of collapsed bore lining, all of it dragged down by the morning's failures and lying across the house's shoulder like a fallen tree across a man climbing out of a well. It can't shed it, Dane said, reading the map's grammar instantly. Load paths, bearing points, a rigger's eye. Look, it's flexing its whole flank away to keep from tearing. It's old. It's been holding a Dead Sea up for 10,000 years, and it budgeted this climb to the jewel, and our junk is sitting on its shoulder. He looked up. It's not stuck. It's being careful. There are children aboard. It thinks there are children aboard, and it will not tear itself. Can it wait? Imka asked. Just hold while it works the problem. The depth gauge answered before anyone could. The aquifer, faithful to its own arithmetic, was still rising through the country the house had vacated, and the light map showed the flood's head climbing the tower's wake and showed the damaged northern flank, cracked at bore 9 by the morning's collapse, the wound that had let 6 strangers in, and showed, in patient amber, what water at full head would do to a cracked and burdened shoulder, given hours. The house could not wait, could not tear, and could not ask. It had never once asked. It had only ever posted and trusted what people did next. Vire, Dane had the handset, and his voice had gone to the place it went when he did arithmetic in public. New picture. The drill rig and the old crane footing came down on the structure's north flank. It's fouled. It can't shed the load without tearing, and the flood's chasing it. Your seismic array should show the strain. We need that iron off its shoulder. A pause that crackled. Dane, that wreckage is 1,100 tons under 30 meters of live spoil at the edge of a displacement event. There's no plant on this site rated to touch it. We lost the crane, we lost the rig. I have hand winches and 400 people. On the bridge of the last ferry, 6 people heard the sentence land, and it was Bren Calder, flat on a sled, one leg ruined, Vask-born 400 generations deep, who started to laugh, and this time there was nothing unkind in it at all. "Rescue lead," he said, when Dane held the handset to him, "listen to me, because rigging is the one church I've never left. You don't need plant. The house is doing the lifting, it just can't pull sideways. All that iron needs is to be walked off its shoulder. Drift lines, snatch blocks, leverage, and every pair of hands on that roster hauling in time. It's a barn raising, Ossa. It's the oldest job there is," he breathed. "Put the steward on. Put the whole line on. And somebody count the pull, loud, so the timing holds. You know how we do." What happened in the next 22 minutes happened in 2 places at once, and Pilo's reconstruction, surface feeds, suit lenses, the array data, the open channel would run in Sarah Hall uncut for a century. On the seabed of the Dead Sea, in the gray before dawn, 400 contract laborers and KL surveyors and kitchen staff and clerks went over the wire that had been strung to hold them back, dragging hand winches and driftline, and swarmed the ground above the buried wreck. The human steward set the anchors. Osavire, rescue lead, ran the load math, shouted from a crate, and down the lines in the language the house was built in, rolled the cadence Sully's Gran had carried out of these very cellars. 1, 2, 3, haul. 400 voices counting in the dark for something underneath them that they could not see, and had decided, on the testimony of one rung bell, to carry anyway. And at the second anchor of the third drift line, hauling in his shirt sleeves with his administrator's slate face down in the dust where he had sat, it was Heskel Drum. He had not been asked. The feed showed him simply appearing in the line between a human welder and a kale cook, taking up slack, and pulling on the count, a careful man whose doctrine had rung under his feet, doing the only honest thing left to do with a falsified premise, which is to put your weight where your citations were. The wreck moved. Iron groaned, spoil ran like surf, the line sang, and 1,100 tons of dead machinery walked, half a meter per haul, off the shoulder of the patient house. On the bridge, they felt it go. The keel cord rose through its registers like relief made audible. The light map's amber knot dissolved, and the house, unburdened by the great-great-grandchildren of its passengers, gathered the last of its 10,000-year budget and climbed. "All stations," Vire's voice said, raw from counting. "Stand clear. Ground's opening. Stand clear and stand down." The last ferry breached sunrise. It came up out of the Dead Sea the way patience comes up out of a long wait, first a ringing in the ground, then a bow wave of dry spoil rolling outward in a perfect circle, and then the tower itself, pale gold in the level light, 40 meters of it and then 60, shedding seabed in slow falls of dust and groundwater that caught the dawn and burned, its amber veins alight from keel to crown, the muster roll glyphs along its flanks igniting column by column as they met the sky for the first time in 10,000 years. The morning wind, which had only ever had crane masts to speak to on this world, found the high galleries of the house and made a sound over them like breath over a bottle, a low, held organ, and 400 people on the seabed heard the Dead Sea's first tide come in. The array logged it. The feeds caught it. But what the witnesses themselves did, every account agrees, was step back, not in flight, altogether, a single tidal step away as the ground swelled, and then stillness, tools lowered, hands loose, faces lifted, 400 upturned faces in the rose light watching a building stand up out of the floor of the world. The human steward removed her hard hat. Down the lines it went like a wave, hats and hoods and helmets coming off, kale and human both, nobody ordering it. The oldest gesture there is arriving on its own, and Heskel Drum, second anchor, third line, sat down slowly on a footing block as if his knees had filed a finding, and stayed there, watching with his slate in the dust. At the tower's base, at ground level, with the last spoil still running off its lintel, the great south door of the patient house, sized for crowds, sized for cargo, sized for stretchers, broke its seam and swung wide on the dawn. They came out as they had come up, Dane and Tovan on the stretcher poles, Bren riding with the fire striker still in his fist, Imka at the buddy line, Pilo recording, and Suli Tan last, her hand trailing on the doorpost the way you touch a thing to promise you'll be back. 6 of them, blinking, filthy, alive, walking down the ramp of a risen miracle into a crowd that did not cheer. The accounts are unanimous. No one cheered, but parted, and went quiet and made the wide, respectful lane you make for a crew coming ashore. The medics took Bren first, which was correct, and the last thing he said before they had him was to the tower, over his shoulder, in trade script, "Keep the kettle on, we'll be back." The house rang once, softly, like a struck cup. It was Asa Vera who reached them first, outrunning her own command structure. And she stopped short of Dane, and looked up, and said with the entire site's instrumentation still wailing behind her, "Report." 6 souls, Dane said. 1 casualty stable, 0 lost. He looked back at the tower standing gold against the morning, and 1 find active. Friendly. 10,000 years overdue at its destination, which is... His voice went somewhere private for a moment and came back, which is here, actually. It was always here. It just needed crew to finish arriving. Behind her, slate retrieved, dust on his shirt sleeves, stood Director Heskel Drum. The silence held its breath. He looked at the 6 of them for a long moment, and at the doctor of the reliquary survey standing on a stretcher pole in ruins of formal field dress, and then he did the only administratively correct thing that has ever also been the right one. He opened the incident log on his slate, in front of witnesses, and read his own morning's orders aloud, entry by entry, the doubled spoil tonnage, the overruled flood model, the charge, the advance clock, and then he said, let the record show the site director was in error on every material finding, that 6 lives were preserved despite his orders and not because of them, and that, the careful voice stopped being careful, and that the structure designated Find 7 is to be referred to in all further documentation by its own name. Rescue Lead Vire has command. I'll be at the second anchor if the lines need pulling. He walked back toward the wreck field. No one stopped him. The patient house, Pilo's feed recorded, let its light rest on his back the whole way. The way you watch a man who has just set down something heavy, to be sure he doesn't pick it up again. The days after a miracle are paperwork, and the paperwork of this one began before Bren was out of surgery. The Reliquary Survey's response fleet made orbit in 60 hours, which for the Reliquary was a dead sprint, and what came down the elevator at the Lantern site was the whole apparatus Tovan had spent his life ascending. 3 first chairs, a Congress recorder, 2 doctrine archivists, an honor guard for the recovered materials, and a sealed directive bearing the sigils of 9 institutions. He met them at the camp's edge in a borrowed contractor's coat, because his field dress was 40 meters up a tower being laundered by a structure that had opinions about how guests were kept, and the senior first chair, Madame Rissigval, who had examined his doctrine defense 11 years ago and called it the finest of its generation, looked from him to the impossible gold spire, standing over the Dead Sea, and said, Dr. Reth, your report reads like a fever. Defend it. I won't, Vaughn said. The honor guard stirred. Val's 4 eyes narrowed by degrees. I won't defend it, Tovan said, because defending findings before authority is the exact methodology that kept every door in this galaxy shut for 300 years. I'll do something better, madame. I'll show you the Dorphy, he gestured politely, at the tower. It's standing right there, and it's the same for first chairs as for freight handlers. You may not bring your seals, your guard, or your standing. You go in carrying someone, or you don't go in. Carrying whom? That, Tovan said, is the curriculum. She went in, history records it plainly, paired with a human water systems apprentice named Davy Okafor, 19, Dane's young cousin, assigned by lot from the roster because the house had made its terms clear within a day of breaching. The doors opened for pairs and parties, mixed, burdened, attending to each other, and for them they opened every single time. They did not open for solo claimants of any species, any age, any rank. The lone and the credentialed could stand at the south door reciting authority until the wind got bored. The lintel stayed dark. But let a clerk pause to take the heavy end of a stranger's crate, and the seam would part for both of them like a kept promise. Resic Val, first chair of the Reliquary Congress, climbed the patient house in 4 hours carrying a share of a teenager's toolkit, was lifted by the flood lock, with her formal robes soaked to the knee, stood on the bridge before the burning watch bill, and came down the next morning visibly rearranged. Her preliminary finding, dictated on the ramp, entered the literature verbatim. The vanished builder locks were never sealed. We were. Recommend the Congress reconvene at this site, in working clothes. Tovan's own filing went up the same relay, and it was 4 sentences long, which for a reliquary doctrine was itself a scandal. The archive titles it, The Withdrawal, and students on 40 worlds now memorize it before they are permitted near a builder site. The doctrine of standing is withdrawn by its author, in full with apology to 3 centuries of doors. The builders did not measure worth, because worth cannot be measured, only spent. Their locks answer the spending. Standing is not shown, it is spent. What the withdrawal set loose took years to be believed. The survey stations on 40 worlds reapproached their dead monuments under the new protocol, in pairs, in crews, carrying water, carrying tools, carrying each other's gear and weight and fear, and the reports came back like ice going off a river in spring. A sealed gallery on Hessine Moor lit its lamps for 2 surveyors splitting 1 ration. A monolith on the crane step, mute through 9 documented sieges, turned warm to the touch the day a survey team carried an injured herder's animal out of a storm in its lee. Door by door, world by world, the galaxy's oldest and most studied silence turned out to be a question patiently repeated in the only language no instrument had been pointed at, and the question was, "Who do you carry?" And the galaxy began clumsily in 40 accents to answer, none of which, Tavan was always careful to say in every account he gave for the rest of his life, was the important part. The important part happened 11 days after the breaching, when Bren Calder came back to the lantern site on a regenerated leg and crutches. He refused, and the contract roster and half the Kale camp walked out across the Dead Sea to the south door of the patient house for what the stewards notice called in two scripts a delivery. They had been preparing it all week, in the way such things actually get prepared, not by committee but by kitchen table conspiracy. Name lists passed hand to hand, genealogies argued over ration tables, message traffic burning between Vask and the freight stations and the labor. Worlds where the old colony's blood had scattered. Sully's idea, taken up by the steward, ratified by nobody, executed by everyone. The muster roll. The wall of children's names with its hundreds of empty token births. The house had waited 10,000 years for that wall to fill, and the evacuation's descendants were not dead, and were not vanished, and were, as Bren had observed from a stretcher, substantially on the payroll, so they filled it. They came up the ramp by families and work crews, 400 of them and more arriving on every shuttle, welders and cartographers and cooks, Vask-born and station-born, children on shoulders, the old steward with her hard hat under her arm, and they climbed the patient house together, pooling at the fountain, counting on the stair for the little ones, loading the provision sleds all or none, and they stood in the honey light of the gallery before the wall that said the house waited for them, and one by one, family by family, they entered their lost cousin's home. A carved token into a small recess, a name read aloud in Transcript, the old form first, then the living one, so the house would hear how the name had weathered. Etta Tan, boarded by her family, 400 generations late and present now. Recess by recess, column by column, light spreading down the wall like dawn down a hillside. The never arriving at last in the arms of what they had become, and the house took each name with its soft struck cup tone and banked them, until the gallery rang continuously, a low sustained chord like a building humming at its work, and the survey instruments outside recorded that the entire structure had brightened by 11%, and was, by every measure they had language for, at rest in a way it had never been since first instrumented. Sully entered her own column's name last. Etta Tan, the wobbling 5 Stroxus of whose tallies were, the genealogist confirmed within the month, her grandmother's grandmother's line exactly. She stood before the filled recess for a while, a 15-year-old in clean coveralls with 400 witnesses at her back and 10,000 years, looking over her shoulder, and what she said was not recorded, because Pilo Ves, recordist, holder of the most complete documentation of the entire event sequence, turned his lens deliberately to the floor and logged one line. Some entries belonged to the entrant. Sarah Hall censured him for the gap in the record. The censure was read aloud at his enrollment ceremony 2 years later as a commendation. It was the muster roll delivery. The instruments agreed afterward that woke the sisters. The gallery chord was still sounding, the last family still filing down the ramp into the afternoon, when the patient house cleared the largest panel of its bridge console and posted, in its deepest habit, the problem where its passengers could see it, a map, not of itself this time, of the sea. The Dead Sea of Vask spread across the Honeystone in veins of light, the old coast, the drowned roads, the lantern site, a bright point at the heart of it, and out across the basin floor, scattered along what had once been the colony's shipping lanes. 6 more points woke one by one, 5 steady, amber, patient, and the 6th flickering, guttering, its light the color of an ember going gray. Beneath the map, the house wrote one line and let it stand. 7 ferries sailed the evacuation, Tavan read aloud, on the bridge, to the 5 people he had been buried with and would never again be entirely separate from. 1 still carries, 6 still wait. 7. Imka breathed, it's a fleet. The whole evacuation, it wasn't boats on the water, it was houses under it. Walking houses, lock to lock, down the drowned roads to the launch fields. Her cartographer's hands were already moving over the map, reading gradients. These 5 are sleeping, holding like this one held. But that one, her finger stopped over the guttering point, far out in the basin's deep country, where the spoil lay thickest. That one's dying. That one, Dane said quietly, is sending. He was right. The array confirmed it within the hour. Faint, damaged, repeating on a cycle the seismographs had been logging for years and filing as geological noise. A pulse out of the deep basin, 5 beats and a pause. A tally, 5 and strike. The count of a house that had been calling roll in the dark for 10,000 years, and getting no answer, and not stopping. The expedition that went out across the Dead Sea 3 weeks later was the strangest column ever assembled in Kale survey history, and the literature has never tried to pretend otherwise. 200 volunteers, riggers, medics, keepers, archivists, the tan girl, and her entire former survey crew, a first chair in working clothes, and a former site director who had requested in writing the duty of second anchor on every load line, following a cartographer's drowned road map behind a 40-meter ambulatory building because the patient house had made its own intentions plain the morning of departure by the simple expedient of pulling up its foundations and taking the first step. No one had known it could walk. In hindsight, everyone agreed, the clue was in the architecture. A ferry is not a monument. The house went out across its dead sea, slow as a glacier and sure as a tide, keel light burning down through the spoil, ringing its great bell every kilometer. Crew coming, hold on. And the column walked in its shadow on the old lane markers, and Tavan Reth walked at the front of it beside a 15-year-old keeper apprentice, and understood, with the wind making organ notes over the high galleries above him, that this was now his job and that there had never been a better one. What they found at the guttering point, under 30 meters of seabed, the recovery teams reached down a relief shaft. The patient house sank itself, flank to flank with its sister like a sound animal standing over a fallen one. The sixth ferry had broken 10,000 years ago. The basin quake that doomed the evacuation's last convoys had caught it mid-passage, full laden, the only one of the 7 that had gotten its children aboard, 400 of them, the records would show, with their tokens entered and their stations crewed, and dropped a kilometer of canyon wall across its back. It had not been strong enough to rise. It had been strong enough just to hold, to seal its hull, bank its heartlight down to embers, pour every jewel of its 10,000-year budget into air and water and warmth for the sleep vaults its builders had designed against exactly this, and to keep calling, 5 and strike, into rock that never answered. The crews came down the relief shaft into a bridge lit like the last hour of a candle and found the watchbill burning at its lowest sustainable ember, 400 berths still lit. Stasis architecture, Sarah Hall calls it now, in the driest finding ever to make 400 scholars weep. The vaults held, the manifest holds. The passengers of the 6th ferry, pending revival assessment, are listed as aboard. Children. The never arrived all along, held under the floor of the world by a broken house that had spent 10 millennia refusing, jewel by jewel, to let its cargo go. The revival took 2 years, and it is its own story, the slow waking, the first small voice asking in 10,000-year-old trade script whether they had reached the launch fields yet, the roster families who took 400 orphans of the old colony into the homes of what the old colony had become, so that the children of the evacuation were raised, in the end, by their own descendants. But the moment that belongs to this story happened the first night, at the bottom of the relief shaft, when the Link crews married the 2 houses' keel lights, and the patient house poured half its remaining budget into its broken sister without being asked, without posting so much as a gauge, and the 6th ferry's bell, cracked and buried and dry for 100 centuries, managed one full ring. Every helmet on the Dead Sea came off at once, and in the deep bridge, Pilo's lens caught the 6th ferry's last unlit panel waking and writing, in letters that guttered and steadied and held. "You came back. We never left," Suli Tan answered in the old script and the new. "It just took us a while to find the door. Crew's here now. Up we go." They raised the 6th ferry that spring, with cradles and drift lines and the pulled weight of 2,000 hands, and the 5 sleeping sisters after her, one by one, until the Dead Sea of Vask had a skyline, 7 gold towers on the old shipping lanes, ringing the hours to each other across 40 kilometers of waking ground, and the long-range arrays began picking up, from survey sites on a dozen distant worlds, the first faint answering pulses of structures nobody had ever thought to listen to. 5 beats and a pause. The rest of a civilization's patient infrastructure, planet by planet, hearing that somewhere a roll call had finally been answered, and taking up the count again. The galaxy calls the basin the Reason Sea now. The maps were redrawn inside a decade. Nobody who redrew them was ever quite able to explain to their grandchildren that within living memory, the towers had been classified as a hazard formation, and the language on their flanks as decoration, and the people who could read it as labor. The rest can be told the way the house itself would tell it, posted plainly where the passengers can see. Heskel Drum served 4 years as second anchor of the Lantern recovery lines, refusing every administrative reinstatement with the same dry clause. The record shows I am better employed where the citations are load-bearing. The patient house opened for him, the first and every time, on the day he first came to its door, not because he was forgiven, the keepers point out, but because he arrived carrying a revival vault child's pack in one hand and her boots in the other, and the house has never once asked any other question. He taught load math to keeper apprentices until the end of his life, And if a student ever asked him why every lesson began with the morning's seismograph readings, he would say only, because the day you stop checking whether the ground is trying to tell you something is the day you write a doctrine. Osavire took the Lantern Site directorship long enough to abolish half its wire fences, then traded it for the post she invented and the Congress ratified without amendment. Harbor Master of the Rising Sea. It is she who codified the rule that every arriving research delegation, regardless of rank, spends its first day on vast hauling line with the dock crews. Publication privileges follow participation. The rule is resented for exactly 1 day per delegation. Imca Reyes mapped the drowned roads of 3 more worlds, found 4 more fleets, and married a revival vault medic in the gallery of the 6th ferry, beneath the muster wall, both families entering both names. Bren Calder trains rigging crews in the shadow of the towers, walks on a leg the vault physicians rebuilt twice out of professional admiration, and has never once, in any recorded account, stopped talking. The kettle rule is posted in his training hall in 11 scripts. Dane Okafor was offered, in sequence, a survey directorship, a Congress seat, a commission in the Joint Fleet, and the first ambassadorship to the revival communities. He declined them all with the unfailing courtesy of a man doing arithmetic in public, and took instead the post the roster invented for him. Wharf Finger of the Patient House, keeper of its manifests, master of its musters, the one who stands at the south door on crossing days and counts the crews aboard. When the Congress recorder, baffled, asked him on the record why, he gave the answer that is now carved over the Wharfinger's door in both scripts. Because the best work I will ever do, I did carrying a stretcher. I intend to stay where that kind of work is. Piloves became the first Kale enrolled as a keeper recordist of the Rising Sea, and his great archive, the testimony of the houses, 40 years in the assembling, opens not with the collapse, not with the breaching, but with a single frame from a dark stairwell. Nothing visible at all, only an audio track, 6 voices counting in 2 languages. His preface beneath it runs 1 sentence. Everything that follows was already present in this recording. The remainder of these volumes is merely the light coming back on. And Tovin Reth, author of The Withdrawal, declined the first chair of the Reliquary Congress in a letter Sarah Hall keeps under glass. I have held standing, and I have held a stretcher pole, and I am qualified to report which one opens doors and lives at the Lantern Site to this day, in a contractor's cabin within sound of the bells, where he teaches the youngest keeper apprentices their letters in 2 scripts and their locks in 1 principle. He has told the story of the long climb more times than the archive can index, to congresses and classrooms in 1 very quiet annual gathering of 6, and every telling ends the same way because he is a scientist, and the finding has replicated on every world it has been tested, and a finding that replicates is owed its plain statement. The doors were never locked. They were patient. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of what the builders knew. A lock keeps people out. Patience waits for them to become the kind of people who can come in. You cannot show a door like that your worth. You can only spend it, on the one beside you, in the dark, on the stairs while the water rises, and the spending is never wasted, even where there is no door at all to see it. That is the curriculum. That was always the curriculum. A year and a day after the breaching, at dawn, a new crew stood at the south door of the patient house. 2 KL students, a human apprentice from the freight stations, a Drev Exchange surveyor on her first posting, and a revival vault boy of 10 who had asked to climb the sister of the house that held him, carrying between them 1 stretcher loaded with nothing but their own packs, because the manual says the stretcher goes up whether or not anyone is hurt yet, and the manual has been right about everything so far. They were frightened, in the ordinary way of crews at the foot of a long climb. The Drev surveyor's hands would not settle. The vault boy stood very close to the human apprentice, who had, without appearing to notice, already taken the heavier half of his pack. The keeper on door duty that morning was 16 years old, with dust in her hair that no amount of clean coveralls would ever entirely outrank, and she watched the little crew sort itself, watched the Drev's restless hands find steadiness in checking the vault boy's harness, watched the count begin, unprompted, low, in 2 scripts, and she stepped back from the lintel, because she knew the seam was about to break before the light came, the way you know a kettle the moment before it sings. Hold on to each other, said Suli Tan, keeper of the patient house, in the language the door was waiting for. The house does the rest. The first glyph lit while she was still speaking, and the door, which had never once in 10,000 years been locked, opened.